Hello everyone, welcome to Lyceum. I'm your host Liam, aka Himbar. Today I want to do a special video, one I've been thinking about for a while, but one I was thinking I wasn't quite qualified to do. But in reality, I'm one of the few champions of this author on this platform, and so I thought I might as well do it, especially since I've been reading more and more by this author and just falling more and more in love, essentially. So, well, I can preface and say I've not read everything by this author, but I have read a good amount. This is one of my most read authors. So, of course, this is kind of a coronation, or at least a recommendation, or like a suggestion to say that this person, this author, might be the best speculative fiction writer out there. Now, of course, you can make arguments probably for people like C.L. Moore and Gene Wolfe, Jack Vance, even, or Clark Ashton Smith, maybe. Um, I was just thinking speculative fiction as it stands of like science fiction, fantasy, and horror. This author did all three exceptionally well. Of course, that is none other than Fritz Leiber, or Fritz Leiber Jr., which he is sometimes known as because, of course, his dad's name is Fritz Leiber as well, and is a rather famous Shakespearean actor. But Fritz Leiber Jr. Is, well, let's see, he was born in 24th of December 1910, and he died on the 5th of September 1992. His writing career professionally spanned from 1939 to 1988, which is a really long time. And there's good stuff that entire time, all those decades. He did write a little before that, but it was in like smaller publications that we wouldn't consider professional, and probably not even speculative fiction. So he did do a lot, actually. So he's considered one of the three masters of sword and sorcery. He coined the term sword and sorcery, which he called an earthier sort of fantasy. He did this in conversation with Michael Moorcock, who's one of the other three masters, along with Robert E. Howard, who's generally considered the father of sword and sorcery. He is also just, again, not just a fantasy person, though. It's this here, if you open up the Knight and Knave of Swords, at least I believe this is the first edition, it says Fritz Leiber is one of the great names in fantastic literature of the century. He has won the Hugo Award 5 times, the Nebula Award 3 times, and the World Fantasy Award. He's the only writer ever to receive the Grandmaster Award of the Science Fiction Writers of America, the Grandmaster Award of the Horror Writers of America, and the World Fantasy Award for Life Achievement. He won that Grandmaster Award for Science Fiction Writers of America before, I believe, Asimov or Clark did. He was the 5th one to get it, Heinlein being the first, of course. And he started his writing career the same year as Asimov and Heinlein. He also was a Gandalf Grandmaster Award. There's only, I think, 7 of those that ever got awarded. He was the second one, the first one being J.R.R. Tolkien himself. So he's a big name. Now, you don't hear a lot about him these days, and I feel like a lot of that might have to do with the fact that he hasn't stayed in print that well for some reason. I don't know if that's his estate's problem or whatever, but he's kind of hard to find. Almost all my copies of his stuff are used. Now, you can get those cheap stuff that's essentially pods, print-on-demand stuff for some of his stuff. But Fritz Leiber is a very interesting character, so I wanted to go over a little bit more about him just briefly, but also just give you recommendations on the fantasy novels you can read by him, the sci-fi novels you can read by him, and the horror novels you can read by him, as well as fantasy, sci-fi, and horror short stories that I'll recommend. I'm leaving out a lot that I really like. There's just too much I like about this guy. And again, I haven't read everything either. You're All Alone, for example, or Destiny Times 3 are novels that come to mind that I haven't read yet. So there's plenty for me to still read. Eventually, I will finish it all, and I'll be very sad. But he's also just a very interesting character. He has very different themes. He has women in his stories, I feel like, a lot more than a lot of his contemporaries did, especially during his earlier days. Sex is very much a theme. It's not really explicit until maybe you get into like the last decade of his life. But he always has this theme of sex, which is he handles it in a very interesting way. I'm not a fan of explicit content anyways, or what you could call erotica. So take that as you will. But he also looks at like religion and like the decadent lifestyle and stuff like that. So he was a priest. At least he went to seminary for a little bit. He was a stage actor for the Shakespearean company that his father and mother ran. He was also a movie actor. You can find him in some movies, mostly early when he was young. Also, when he was older, though, he appeared in like a cult classic horror film called The Equinox, I believe, or just Equinox. He's also a fencer, and you can tell when you read his fantasy in particular. And he was also a chess player. He even won a chess tournament. He was a playwright, he was a poet, and he was a member of the Lovecraft Circle. Um, you can even, there's a quote from S.T. Joshi and David Scholes, who they say, Joshi being the chief Lovecraft scholar, for those unaware, Leiber wrote some of the most distinguished science fiction, fantasy, and horror literature of the century, and is perhaps the only one of H.P. Lovecraft's colleagues who can rival him in literary substance. He even, again, just more, he even contributed to early speculative fiction scholarship with his essay A Literary Copernicus, which I believe was written in 1945, maybe 44, maybe originally published by Derleth, though, in 49, very early still. And he kind of looks at Lovecraft in that essay as a Copernicus figure of a shift from supernatural horror to this cosmic horror. And he's disagreeing with Derleth and his view of this good versus evil mythos that, that Derleth said Lovecraft had going on. But let's get into the recommendations, because I've been talking for too long already. That's the introduction. I can't shorten it, guys. So for fantasy novel, I'm going to suggest two things here, okay? My first is going to be Swords Against Death. I'm going to suggest a third one, actually, too. But Swords Against Death is the second Fafhrd and Grey Mouser book, or also called the Lankhmar series, or the Swords series, because they all have sword in the title. Or you can also find this in the bind-up of called Ill Met in Lankhmar. Now, don't get that confused. There is a novella called Ill Met in Lankhmar, but there's a bigger bind-up. I actually have it on the shelf. I should have grabbed it. But if it's bigger, it has the Mignola cover art, the famous comic book artist from like Hellboy, stuff like that, if I remember correctly, at least. So Swords Against Death is a fix-up novel, though, which is something that a lot of fantasy readers today are probably not very familiar with. It's essentially short stories combined chronologically to make a novel. It works really well. These are phenomenal stories. I don't want to go over all of them because this video would be too long. But it is the second book in the series. So that's why, while a lot of people will suggest you start with this one because it gives you a better taste, these are most of the early stories. It's really hard, especially, if you are one of those people who are really strict about publication order. They're short stories. Good luck reading them in publication order. You could, if you bought like the first 5 volumes and then you opened up which ones were published first, but you're going to have a hard time. But this series is 7 books long normally when it's published in this form, which they're rather short. So Swords Against Death, though, is generally considered the second book. Again, it's a fix-up novel. The first one, if you want to start at the very beginning chronologically, is Swords and Deviltry. But these stories were almost all written later. 60s, I believe, is when all of them were written, if I'm remembering correctly. Now, this introduces the characters. The first story introduces Fafhrd, who is a barbarian from the north, and the second story introduces the Grey Mouser, who's a rogue, a sorcerer, kind of an apprentice, and short. He's very short, and he wears gray. And that introduces their kind of coming of age, essentially. And then the third story, Ilmet and Lankhmar, gives you their coming together, the start of their bromance, essentially. Now, if anyone likes bromance fantasy, this is the bromance fantasy. There are none better. I will not take any other opinions. They're not even close. Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser are the best bromance fantasy duo in fantasy. No match, not even close. Okay, they're called the Twain as well sometimes. So they are phenomenal. They're the best swordsmen of any universe ever. To kind of paraphrase Leiber there. The other novel I could recommend for fantasy, for those who like more traditional novels and not a fix-up novel, is The Swords of Lankhmar, which of those 7 books is the only one that's a novel. There is a novel in The Knight and Knave of Swords, I believe, called Rime Isle, but that's, again, fixed up with other stuff later on. So, but The Swords of Lankhmar is book 5. I didn't get it out this time. Again, too many books around me. Yeah, it's a novel. It's a good one. It has weird rat creatures and ghouls and other things going on. So it's not my favorite. It's not where I normally recommend you start. And I still wouldn't recommend you start there. I'd give these fix-up novels a try. But I realize some people are stuck in their ways. So anyways, then sci-fi novels. I wanted to go with first the Green Millennium, just because I think this one's really fun. This is from 1953. It feels very pre-cyberpunk to me. In fact, it kind of is, right? I mean, Leiber is who inspired William Gibson in a lot of ways. And this one involves aliens and punk kids, kind of, and cats, and wrestling with women wrestling with masks on and stuff like that. It's kind of a weird story, getting caught up with this green cat. This green cat shows up at someone's house, and then there's this wild goose chase for this green cat. Where did it come from? Where's it going? You'll have to find out in the Green Millennium. I think it's hilarious and just really fun. Just shows off Leiber's abilities. Another good one that's in some ways more popular is The Big Time. It won the Hugo Award. Came out a few years after the Green Millennium. This one is really interesting because it's essentially all on a stage. It takes place in one room. Paul Anderson said he would love to see it as a play, and I agree with Paul Anderson. Leiber wrote it that way on purpose. He had experience on the stage, had experience acting. He's very Shakespearean. You can see, especially after Ursula K. Le Guin, says he should be better in From Elfland to Poughkeepsie. If you've read that essay, Leiber is mentioned in it. But The Big Time is just kind of, it essentially is a time travel story of a war of one faction versus another. Now, this is a time travel where time is not easily affected. You have to do a lot to change time. But it's funny because you have characters who are like literally a Roman centurion, a Nazi, and some weird tentacled alien from the moon that lived 1 billion years ago. Those are like some of the main characters, but it's all narrated by this young woman from Chicago. It was contemporary at the time the novel was written, if I'm remembering correctly. So, The Big Time, I think, is very fun, and it's the big introduction to his Change War series, which is this time travel stuff. And then another big one that won the Hugo Award that isn't my favorite, but it's The Wanderer, and it has a lot of good stuff. It's a little longer, so for those used to more the novel size of today, it has sexy cat aliens, I guess, which isn't that weird for Leiber. But the things it does interesting are it has this Wanderer, which is essentially a big dumb object before 2001: A Space Odyssey came out, or Ringworld, for example. And this Wanderer gives you hints of this space opera type universe that you don't really see because it's a first contact story. It's also a horror story, essentially like a destruction story where a bunch of mayhem is going all over the earth. And that's also cool because you get multiple point of views, which is, again, not very common at the time. You have point of view from in Vietnam or around there in Germany and England and the United States, mostly United States, I will admit, but still all over the world. And it's pretty interesting how these people have to deal with these insane tides and earthquakes and these aliens, and how they treat the moon specifically. So that is another one you might be interested in. And then one I find particularly fun is Gathered Darkness. This is one of his first novels, actually. It came out the same year as Conjure Wife, a little later in the year, if I'm remembering correctly. So same year as his debut novel, but not quite his debut novel. This one is what we'd probably call these days science fantasy. It's dystopian in the future where these single religion and these priests rule everything. It kind of does this Asimov thing. Asimov didn't do it as well, where these priests use technology to act like they have this godlike power, essentially. And so the bad guys, who are really the good guys in this novel, are Satan worshippers, and it's hilarious. They say Hail Sathanas, and they invoke their meetings by saying Gather Darkness, and that's the name of the novel, which I think is just one of the sickest names for a novel, honestly, ever. Honestly, it also has 2 punctuation marks, which is cool. But no, very, very fun, I think. And then the last one I'll mention, because again, I have too much to mention, is The Night of the Long Knives. Some say it's a novella. I'm not quite sure on the word count there, but it's really short. And this is post-apocalyptic, where the center of the United States has become like a wasteland, essentially. And so you have these weird people who are more animal than human in a lot of ways, and they have weird modifications, and they're just going around, and they steal an airplane from these people that are well advanced, and they're not living like animals in this atomic wasteland. It's actually really, really gripping, I thought. Very fun. It's got an interesting romance, if you would. So yeah, I'll stop there for sci-fi, though. There's others. His horror novels I would recommend. I'm going to recommend 2, and the second one I haven't read, so I'm actually going to mention that one first. It's Conjure Wife. It's about essentially every woman in the world is a witch. because then this guy who works at a university finds out, and he says, found that his wife's a witch, and he's like, hey, you shouldn't do that. And then he starts, doing bad at work, or like his coworkers get promotions because their wives are witches too. And now she's not helping him out. His wife is not helping him out like she should be, like all the other wives are, I guess. So that one actually won a Retro Hugo Award, and that's his debut novel. Came out same year as Gather Darkness. It's been adapted into like television and movies like several times. I think Burn Witch Burn is the most popular one from like 1962. But my favorite horror novel I've read by him, because it's really the only one, though you could count almost everything he wrote as horror. He always has that tinge in his stories. Is Our Lady of Darkness. This came out in 77, I believe, so it's rather late. I could be misremembering that, but I know it was later. And it's this is very interesting. It's got a lot of autobiographical elements. If you like Robert E. Howard, who just has this energy to his writing, you get this a lot in Our Lady of Darkness. You get it a lot in another story I'll mention in a minute too when I get the short stories. But this was written after Fritz Leiber's wife had passed away, and his struggles with alcoholism and just substance abuse. And it's very interesting because it looks Ralph Blutax, who's I'm going to just say is a famous reviewer or critic or whatever, says essentially this is the novel that Stephen King wished he could write. Take that as you will. Our Lady of Darkness, though, is really good. It's set in San Francisco. It has this cool Jungian like ideas of like reversal and stuff like that, and it's really fun about essentially a ghost type of being that's made up of paper from his pulp magazines. The author and the main character of this book is an author, very much like Fritz Leiber. He lives in the same room as Fritz Leiber lived in San Francisco after he became a widower. It has Clark Ashton Smith as a character through journal entries. Also mentions other authors like Ambrose Bierce and other similar California figures. Like that one guy I'm blanking who wrote White Fang, I believe. Wow, Jack London. So stuff like that. It's really, really fun, and it's really creepy. So I like it a lot. That's the novels, though. I realize I'm 17 minutes in, but I'm going to keep on going, and I'm going to try to make these short story recommendations a little shorter. So for fantasy short stories, essentially these are ones that are not in Swords Against Death, because that's my main recommendation for the fantasy novel. And so that's Lean Times on Lankhmar, which I'm blanking. I think that might be in Swords in the Mist. There's a lot, right? It might be Swords Against Wizardry or Swords in the Mist, one of those two. Lean Times on Lankhmar, though, is probably the funniest fantasy story I've ever read. It is hilarious. It's a very interesting look at religion and just priesthoods in general. And you can tell Leiber didn't really like his experience with the priesthood, and also his experience with Hollywood. He didn't care for it. He thought it was decadent. And he'll make fun of that in stories as well. But Lean Times on Lankhmar is about a jug god. And Fafhrd and Grey Mouse are not really being very nice to each other at the time, and so they go their separate ways, and Fafhrd becomes a priest of this jug god. And very funny events happen. Very much like a stage thing. You can tell, I mean, this is Leiber knows the stage like the back of his hand. But it's hilarious. Lean Times Lankhmar, check it out. Another one is The Two Best Thieves on Lankhmar, which again is either Swords in the Mist or Swords Against Wizardry. I think it's Swords Against Wizardry. This one is a very much of a reversal. It's sword and sorcery, but if I remember correctly, there's no fighting in this one, which is interesting for sword and sorcery. You could say that violence is a staple from sorcery, and in a lot of ways it is. But not in this one. This is kind of showing you the two best thieves in Lankhmar are maybe not who you assume they are. Lankhmar being the chief city where a lot of the Fafhrd and Grey Mouse stories take place. It's essentially Greyhawk, copying Lankhmar, Ankmar Pork copying Lankhmar, because Lankhmar is eternal. But it is very good. It's very funny. It has some queer representation, which is very interesting for when it came out. You might say it's a little cringe, depending on who you ask. But I think the story works very well. It's very funny. And it shows you that our two best thieves in Lankhmar, again, are not who you assume, and Fafhrd and Grey Mouse are rather idiotic at times and very much buffoons. They're very much bros, right? They don't succeed at everything. Another good one that I'm not actually the biggest fan of, but it has some cool elements in it. These invisible beings at the top of the tallest mountain in the world called Stardock, which is a sick name for a mountain, but it's essentially Mount Everest on the world of Neowan, which is where Lankhmar is. And Stardock is just, again, this expedition to the tallest mountain in the world. if that sounds cool to you, a fantasy expedition to tallest mountain in the world, that sounds like it might be for you then. Another one is Ilmet and Lankhmar, which I mentioned earlier because it's the last story in Swords and Deviltry. This is another one along with Our Lady of Darkness that just feels powerful when you read it. This was written right around the time his wife passed. And you can tell this is a story that you cry and you cheer at the same time. At least me. This is one of the ones I've read and reread from Leiber. It is that, and it just works so effectively because it has all that emotion tied into it, but it's also the meeting of Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser. It's where they meet up, and they become like instant bros. It's like destined, essentially. So it's so good. It's so good, and it's essentially going into a thieves' house, a thieves' guild. Again, if you've seen D&D, the idea of thieves' guilds, it comes from Lankhmar, it comes from Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser. Also, Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser are the most D&D type characters you will ever read because they are idiotic. It is more like how D&D is actually played rather than how you imagine it, which is something probably more like Dragonlance or whatever, or Lord of the Rings. But it's never played like that, right? So it's more like you're playing Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser. They steal a house at one point. I mean, they're dumb, right? So, and another good one besides Ilmet and Lankhmar, the last of the fantasy ones I'll recommend, is one that's from Swords and Ice Magic, if I remember correctly, which is a 6 Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser book. The first 5 are generally considered to be the best, but this is the first story in that. It's called The Sadness of the Executioner, and it's really good. It's essentially Death trying to fill a quota of death, right? The person, persona or whatever, this archetype. And he's got 20 seconds to do it. And he's like, I need like 2 heroes. And he tries to kill Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser. It doesn't work out. I will warn that there's a rape scene in this one. It's very short, of course, but it might be not for some people. But otherwise, Sadness of Executioner is really cool, I think. And it's really wild as later Leiber kind of gets really wild sometimes. And then for sci-fi short stories, I have a few for this. I have Coming Attraction, which is when I got the big book of cyberpunk recently, the oldest story in that collection is this one, Coming Attraction from 1950. This is very much cyberpunk, but not, right? It's post-apocalyptic, more so. But it's about an Englishman visiting New York and the things he experiences there, like microwave food. 1950, microwaves were not really much of a thing, definitely not in households. And you have women wrestlers that wear masks first as a weird like statement, kind of like that's their thing. Instead of wearing makeup, they wear masks. There's also a woman with knives in her nails, just like Molly Millions. There's essentially you can watch TV anywhere and a lot of this stuff. And there's just a lot of weird stuff. I could talk more about it, and I will actually when I go over the story in the big book of cyberpunk with Tim. But very, very interesting story. Lots of weird stuff. There's another like part where this guy has this fish hooks attached to his car to pull off skirts, for example. So yeah, anyways, and then another interesting one, which you wrote, I think, the same year, which is crazy to me. I think maybe all these were written the same year, about 1 year period at least. But so this, because I only have 2 more, is A Pail of Air. That was the first one. This one is interesting. It's basically Earth has become a rogue planet. It got tossed out of the solar system, and so everything froze. Water froze, and then the atmosphere froze. And so it's about this boy, his dad sent him out to get a pail of air, and that they have to thaw so they can breathe. It's kind of horrifying. It's very, very interesting, and it's more hard science, right? It's accurate scientifically, which Leiber doesn't always do. The Wanderer is more hard science as well for the novels, if you're wondering. But yeah, very interesting story. I really enjoyed that one. And then another one's Poor Superman, also originally called Appointment in Tomorrow, which is kind of making fun of earlier Golden Age sci-fi writers. But it's funny because it came out in like 50 or 51, so it's very much still in that what we would generally consider the Golden Age of sci-fi. And Leiber, he's got these themes and these ideas in this writing style he just loves to use that is not as stiff. It's not as outdated, you could say, of a lot of the Golden Age stuff that I've read. And so it's just making fun of that in a lot of ways. It's got his character more in operaly, which appears in a lot of his books as well, like The Wanderer and The Green Millennium. Yeah, so that's a good one. So I get to his horror short stories to finally end this. I want to recommend first The Automatic Pistol, which I actually read in where it was originally published. He published in Weird Tales, 1940, his first appearance, Weird Tales. It sounds really lame. An automatic pistol? What does that even mean? It does not mean that it's an automatic pistol, what you're probably thinking it means. That it's more of a haunted pistol. And when I read that story, I had to turn more lights on in my house. I got creeped out that bad. And it sounds lame as heck. But it's very interesting, kind of about like mafia men and this pistol and, killing each other off kind of type of thing. And then you have The Girl with the Hungry Eyes, which again, I have the book for, but I didn't grab it. Yeah, I didn't grab it. But that one has a mind vampire, a psychic vampire, pulling off energy of people, which might be one of the earlier cases of this as well. I believe this one was adapted into a movie as well. But it came out in like 49, I think. So pretty early stuff again. Leiber did a lot of horror early on. And you can read a lot of these short stories, by the way, in like collections like The Best of Fritz Leiber or The Book of Fritz Leiber is another one. And then another short story is Smoke Ghost, which is often considered his best one. I actually like the automatic pistol more. But the reason it's considered important is because it's taking Lovecraftian stuff tends to be out in the country or far away somewhere. Leiber very much puts his stories in urban environments in New York City and Chicago and Houston and San Francisco and Los Angeles. They're urban environments. And in a lot of ways, he's considered one of the pioneers of urban fantasy, actually, because of this. Like Our Lady of Darkness is often considered urban fantasy, and it is, right? It's horror, but it's urban fantasy as well. And so Smoke Ghost is essentially taking what you might consider the normal ghost trope, but putting it in a city. And what would a ghost in a city be like? Might be made out of smoke. And then we have another one, which is Belson Express, which I read in the second book of Fritz Leiber, which this is all covered in smoke. Speaking of smoke, this shouldn't be this dark. But Belson Express is essentially someone that it's interesting because it's observing a character who is afraid of Nazis to a point where it's paranoia. But he's very much acts like a Nazi himself in his arrogance and his prejudices against people. And so it's a very interesting look. Again, Belson, I believe, being the death camp, and just kind of this breakdown of this character from, again, his own paranoia, but also supernatural means. So very creepy story again. And then the last one I will mention, just because it's taking too long, is The Mind Spider, which you can read in The Mind Spider and other stories. It's actually the last story in this collection, at least this version of it. It's very much a Lovecraft pastiche. No, it's not explicitly in the Cthulhu mythos, though Leiber does do a couple of those for those who like the Cthulhu mythos. You can read To Arkham in the Stars and The Terror from the Depths. But The Mind Spider is more of a less explicit pastiche. It's very much like At the Mountains of Madness, essentially. But instead, it's an alien type creature, but he does some things like putting it in the future. For example, there's planets that are colonized, and they have like blaster pistols, and just stuff like that. But they also have supernatural elements. There's telepaths. It's about telepaths, a family of telepaths, and them not quite unearthing a creature in like Antarctica, but unlocking this creature's mind through their telepathy. Oops. Really creepy. Again, it works really well if you've read At the Mountains of Madness. I think you'll see some things. It very much also feels like The Thing, the classic movie, because The Thing is taking a lot from that Mountains of Madness. So, anyways, really enjoyable story. But that being said, that's it on my recommendations. I still haven't read a lot of like the stuff that I feel like I would enjoy it, like Conjure Wife. Again, I haven't read. You're All Alone. Destiny Times 3, A Spectre is Haunting Texas, that is a great opening line from the Communist Manifesto. Opens something like that for those unaware. The Silver Eggheads, I haven't read that stuff. Or Catch That Zeppelin that I mentioned, or Ship of Shadows, which also won a Hugo Award. That'll be up next probably. So lots of great stuff. And again, he just does it all so well. Again, like I said, he is the king of speculative fiction because he did fantasy, sci-fi, and horror exceptionally well. And I'm just a little sad that he's not that popular these days. And I'd be interested in what other people think, right? I mean, part of the problem is a lot of people read presently, right? Essentially, they'll say like, oh, this classic from when I was born in the 90s or something like that. And then they have this mind then that modern writing styles is what works for them. And so maybe something like Liber would be a little outdated just because it's not written in a modern mode. I think a lot of it holds up really well, though. And I highly recommend. I can't recommend it enough. That's why I made this whole video that's 30 minutes long just for you guys. So anyways, let me know if you've read anything by Fritz Leiber that you enjoyed or you didn't enjoy. Let me know what it was or whatever. Let me know your thoughts. Let me know what you're going to read first. That's what you should do. Anyways, this has been Liam from Liam's Lyceum. I'll catch you next time.